Welcome and thanks for coming to our event today. It's a pleasure to have another event in a series that we've been able to host for the last couple of years called the Middle East Security Series, sponsored by Carol Becker, who's an alumna of the Maxwell School and has been a loyal supporter of INSKID over the years and is deeply invested in issues in the Middle East herself. She wished that she could be with us today, and one of the reasons that we're going to tape the session is so she can watch from New York City.
Oh, wow, that's nice.
So it's good we applied makeup.
Technology.
Yeah.
So much makeup.
It's a pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Professor Daphné Richemond-Barak. I met Daphné in 2006 at ICT in Herzliya, Israel, where at the time I think she was an interloper, but she is now, has been since 2009, a professor in the Ratzner School of Law at IDC, and more recently affiliated also with ICT, the Institute for Counterterrorism in the Lauder School. As many of you know, the arrangement at IDC Herzliya is somewhat like our own here at Syracuse, in that there's a center, ICT, that bridges the college, the School of Law there at IDC, as well as the Lauder School, which is roughly equivalent to the Maxwell School. So our partnership was an easy one to arrange, and Daphné has been an integral part of it since the beginning. Daphné is barely educated. She did her undergraduate work in Paris, has a law diploma at Oxford, an LL.M from the Yale Law School, and a Ph.D. from Tel Aviv University. Other than that, she's not gone to school. In addition to her academic work, which is young, emerging, impressive, and growing, she also had a stint as a clerk at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and before that worked in the New York City law firm of Cleary Gottlieb. Daphné's been working now for a few years on the problem of private security and how to deal with non-state actors. We've had many workshops and private discussions and arguments and agreements about these topics. So please join me in welcoming Daphné Richemond-Barak.
Is this working? Tom, the tech, is still around? Can you hear me? Is this working, the microphone? Okay, great. Thank you, Bill, for your very kind introduction. I could begin this talk by having the usual line that it's such a pleasure to be here. You know, I'm very honored to be invited, but all that would be a lie, because I am so delighted to be here. I'm so delighted to be finally in Syracuse. Like Bill said, we've been working together for 6 years, and it's my first time here, so really, it's such a great pleasure to be here. It's such a nice and warm welcome I've gotten from everyone. So I can't be thankful enough to all the faculty members and the students. And I'm really excited to meet you today and also hear your thoughts about some of the things that I'm going to be discussing. So what I'd like to speak about today is, of course, the private security and military industry, like the title indicates. And here I'm referring to the tens of thousands of private citizens who are working for private companies alongside mostly Western and sophisticated armed forces throughout the Gulf and in Iraq and in Afghanistan, but also in the Balkans and in Colombia, Latin America, and elsewhere in the world. When we speak about the private security and military industry, we've been programmed to think about it with skepticism. And also, it rings in our heads the bell of certain buzzwords like oversight and accountability and abuses and violations and immunity, and not to mention vacuum of the law and inherently governmental functions and more and more. So this is kind of the general climate in which we discuss this industry. And here maybe I'm not going to meet up with your expectations, but today I'm not going to address the industry from that point of view. Not that any of these buzzwords of skepticism is inaccurate, and that's not what I'm trying to say, but what I think we see is that by focusing too much on these aspects, we overlook some of the very important trends, and some of them are laudable, at least in regulatory terms, that are taking place in the private security and military sector. So it's on these trends and these regulatory advances that I want to focus today, because I believe that we actually witnessing a very profound shift in the industry, from an industry that used to operate in the shadows to one that is becoming increasingly transparent and accountable, and I would say even, I would dare to say, maybe compliant with the law as well, or at least we're moving in that direction. So in addition to being a major shift in the industry itself, and this is something that I'll get to towards the later part of the talk, we also, this development is also major for international law, because we are dealing with a non-state actor which is involved in regulation, involved in its own regulation, in regulating its own activity, and oftentimes actually in cooperation with states and other actors. So that is something that we need to reflect on, not only for the industry, but also for the greater implications that this may have for international and potentially other non-state actors as well. And I'll get back to that a bit later on. So what I'll try to do today is, first of all, highlight the progress that has been made in the regulation of the industry, and particularly in the realm of self-regulation, and I'll explain what are the different emerging self-regulatory frameworks. And also because I think that we have, that the regulatory environment has really been enhanced by these self-regulatory initiatives, but we haven't reached a perfect state of regulation. Nevertheless, I want to suggest some ways in which we can further exploit the potential of self-regulation, and with that, is this the phone that's making this sound? Yeah, it could be the timer is conflicting with the. So I'll take it off, but you have to time me then. So not only suggest ways in which we can further exploit self-regulation, and well, we need to maximize, essentially, my point is we need to maximize the potential of self-regulation, but also make an effort to try to overcome the inherent weaknesses of self-regulation. And for that reason, I want to propose today a new regulatory model for the industry, and also point again to some of the implications that these developments have had, not only for the industry, but also for global governance and for international law more generally. So the outsourcing of the security and military services, as we know this, as this outsourcing has been taken shape today, it began a little over a decade ago with a very sharp and dramatic increase after September 11. But when we talk about the industry, of course, and we witnessed this growth in the last decade or so, we shouldn't forget that the outsourcing of the practice of hiring soldiers for money is nothing new, really. We have records of this even in the Bible. So it's a very old practice that has taken on a whole new form and different shape. But in and of itself, it is not new. What is new, rather, is the scope of the phenomenon. And that means that what we see today is, by virtue of its scope, different from what the outsourcing of military functions may have been in the past. First of all, private security and military contractors are present on virtually every theater of operations today. In addition, they have gotten involved in increasingly sensitive functions, such as intelligence gathering or even target identification. Some of them are operating drones, etc., etc. So the type, in numbers and in type of the functions that they are performing, that is something that is very, very new. And the fact of the matter is that the presence of contractors on the battlefield at times either equal or outnumbers the number of soldiers on the battlefield, and that's also one of the major developments. So if we take a look at this quote, for example, just a few days ago, David Eisenberg, who's an expert on the industry, he just wrote in Time, this little piece is an excerpt of what he wrote, that there is approximately 137,000 contractors working for the Pentagon. And here, I just want to point your attention, this is just the Pentagon. So we're not even talking about those that are there to support even multinational corporations, for example, provide security for multinational corporations that are operating in volatile environments. But so just for the Pentagon, these are the numbers. And what he says is, put simply, there are more contractors than US troops in Afghanistan. And I think that's really the major element here, that we are dealing with a phenomenon whose scope is unprecedented. And today, the sophisticated military forces, they really cannot do without contractors anymore. So for a long time, there was not great awareness of this phenomenon, and the awareness really grew in the wake of the scandals in Abu Ghraib and in Fallujah and in Nisour Square a few years ago. And the response to these scandals was one of public outrage. First of all, oh my God, we didn't know there were so many contractors there, and we had no clue what kind of functions they were performing. So that was the first kind of reaction. And later, as the understanding and of the industry grew, and also there was the fear that this force that was present on conflict zone was under-regulated. So coupled with the numbers and the kind of functions they were performing and the sense that these activities were not sufficiently regulated, this led the industry players to seek more legitimacy. And how did they do that? They tried to show that they were abiding by certain norms of conduct. The problem was that there was no readily applicable legal framework to the activities of these private security and military contractors. Domestic law, on one hand, was not sufficiently equipped to deal with them because by nature, the phenomenon is completely global. International law, on the other hand, and it's more, to be a little more specific, the formal avenues within international law, like the United Nations, for example, they couldn't keep track with this fast-growing industry, constantly evolving, constantly changing. It just didn't work. So we had domestic law and international law somewhat unable to tackle the issue. And so it is in this context that self-regulation began to take shape, and that private security and military companies got involved into something that I would argue strangely resembles lawmaking. It was a fertile environment for self-regulation to emerge, and now, a few years into it, we realized how much law, or we can talk about whether it's law or not, but what has been created, what is the product that we've had from these emerging self-regulatory framework. So I will actually give you an idea of what the frameworks look like before we move on. Some of you might be familiar with them and others not. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. The first very important thing to talk about is to say that all these self-regulatory schemes in the industry, they are voluntary in nature. Like I said, they've evolved very, very rapidly. We're talking about only a few years. They tend to be transnational, and this is very, very important, they are non-binding on their participants. In other words, we're not talking about binding frameworks. And another element that's important in understanding these schemes is that they are the product, in general, of the joint efforts of the private and the public sectors working together to develop standards that are applicable to the conduct of private security and military companies. So I want to walk you through briefly 3 levels of regulation, starting from the bottom up, if you wish. So first of all, at the level of the company, what happens is that we see more and more companies adopting their own codes of conduct. The codes of conduct that companies typically adopt are written documents. They are non-binding again, and they typically lay down usually moral/ethical standards, sometimes even legal standards, or at least mentioning some of the legal instruments that are relevant, like the Geneva Conventions, human rights conventions, in order to have these instruments guiding the conduct of their own employees on the ground when they are deployed in conflict zones. What's interesting is that when we look at company codes, what we see is that they really reflect their content. They've evolved a lot with time, and their content tends to reflect the greater developments that the industry is facing itself. So in the very beginning, those codes of conduct, they were really kind of just laying out standards, and they were very, very soft instruments. They are still fall within the category of soft instruments. However, we noticed a little change in a sense that more and more of these company codes of conduct have begun to incorporate or to set up internal mechanisms within the company to ensure that they are being complied with. And that's really interesting trend. And also, at times, external mechanisms to ensure that the company codes are being complied with. And that would, for example, be the case of a few codes. It's not yet the major pattern, but a few codes do contemplate the possibility that the company will refer a non-compliant employee to public authorities for sanctioning, etc. So that would be, in a way, complementing or on top of whatever internal disciplinary measures or perhaps even the termination of employment that the company could take against the employee. So, and that's major in the sense that the company would know, if that becomes the norm, the company would no longer be the sole entity responsible to sanction non-compliant employees, and something that the companies are not really well equipped to do, to sanction. It's, other than firing the employee, what can they really do? So these kind of internal/external mechanisms that we're starting to see are a welcome development. So that's from within the companies. The companies have established sometimes hotlines, sometimes complaint mechanisms, but mostly through the codes of conduct. Now, at the industry level, the companies have regrouped into industry associations. And those associations have assumed with years and with time an ever-growing role in both developing and promoting self-regulation. How? First of all, they've designed their own code of conduct, and that's really an important part. Again, their own codes of conduct, they're very similar to the codes of conduct of the companies. Also, in the beginning, much softer, and we see some development in trying to make them with more teeth. And also, we see a very strong involvement on the part of industry associations in developing self-regulation. What does that mean? Industry associations are involved in basically this later, the number 3, the multi-stakeholder initiatives. They are very involved. They come to the meetings. They submit proposals. They give feedback. And then later on, when whatever instruments are being adopted, they actually promote it. They promote it to their members. They really make efforts to try to have the standards being complied with across the industry. But really the most interesting part of this whole self-regulatory framework that's emerging is the institutional level, the multi-stakeholder level, where we see public and private actors coming together to improve regulation in the industry. So the first major initiative was launched by Switzerland, so a state, and the International Committee for the Red Cross, the ICRC, in 2006. And the process involved many consultations among all the multi-stakeholder in the industry. So that means not only states, but also NGOs, and also, of course, the companies and civil society working together to try to develop standards that would be acceptable to all parties involved. The document is called the Montreux document. It was adopted in 2008. It is non-binding, but it significantly boosted the effort of the industry to self-regulate by doing 2 things. First of all, it reminded states that they have certain obligations under human rights law and under humanitarian law when they hire security companies. And it also, and most remarkably, went beyond the law, that Montreux document, by creating what is known as good practices, so additional insight or additional recommendation to the states when they hire companies, what other aspects they should pay attention to. And so this document, and this was a major achievement, not only did it succeed in coming up with some standards, but it was extremely well received by everyone. It was well received by the United Nations. It was well received by states. The industry really welcomed their adoption and decided to start promoting them, like I said, not only at the industry association level, but at other levels as well. So this was a major achievement, not only in terms of standard setting, but also in terms of garnering the support of all parties involved. The next step was to take the principles that were expounded in the Montreux document and find a way to make sure that it would also be implemented by individual companies, because the Montreux document is really addressed to states, whereas the International Code of Conduct was the document that was meant to be addressed to companies specifically. And so for that purpose, the International Code of Conduct for private security providers was drafted, and this is really phenomenal. In the beginning, it only had 58 signatory companies, and today it has over 500 signatory companies. So we see really a strong, very good reception of these instruments among the industry. the Montreux document and the International Code of Conduct were both essentially, one was the continuation of the other. They were both convened by the Swiss government and the ICRC. So the same pattern of truly broad-based initiative, bringing everyone together around the same table, trying to come up with something that's acceptable to everyone. And the part that's very important is that within the International Code of Conduct itself, there was one provision that actually made it, got the signatory companies to the International Code of Conduct to commit to work with states to create better governance, compliance, and accountability for the industry. So in 2011, when the Code of Conduct was adopted, it was already contemplated that in the near future, so 18 months, it's not a long time, we'd have to find a way to create mechanisms that would ensure compliance with all these nice standards that we've elaborated. So in other words, beyond the standard setting, it was already the plan to find a way to make sure that these standards would actually be, that they would be monitoring of the compliance with the standards. And this is exactly what the industry set out to do. It tried to come up with a way to create an oversight mechanism whose responsibility it would be to ensure compliance with the standards. And that's how in 2011, the International Governance and Oversight Mechanism, which is known as IGOM, was drafted. So what is it? It's a draft plan for the creation of a monitoring / sanctioning mechanism to ensure compliance with the standards that are developed in the Code of Conduct. And this was a draft. And what's really interesting is that instead of just adopting that draft, the multi-stakeholder initiatives, which is composed of states, civil society, and industry representatives, opened this draft for consultation, public consultation. So for a number of months, the public and the industry and other actors, governmental actors, were able to give feedback on this draft oversight mechanism. And so at the moment, we're just falling within the time period where they are looking over the changes that they are going to make to IGOM in light of the comments and suggestions and feedback that they've gotten from the public at large. So I could spend some time describing to you IGOM, but I think it doesn't make sense because it's going to change. However, what's interesting is just to note that IGOM, the oversight mechanism which is being contemplated, insists has some very interesting features which won't change and which we can just very briefly highlight. The first one is that it's a highly participatory scheme. What do I mean by participatory? It means that all 3 stakeholder groups are involved, must give approval for anything to happen. So for example, if a company wants to be admitted into the ICOC or into IGOM, then it requires the approval of the representatives of the states, the representative of civil society, and the representatives of the industry. If a company needs to be excluded from IGOM, suspended or at all excluded from IGOM, that also requires the approval of all 3 stakeholder groups. So the decision-making processes, the admission, the imposition of sanctions, all of this requires the approval of all stakeholder groups. And that's something that won't change because it's really this is what basically characterizes the most this scheme. Another thing that's interesting about IGOM is that it contemplates soft dispute settlement mechanisms. So it does have a complaint mechanism, and it does have also, it contemplates also the possibility that there would be a mediation process if there's disputes between companies or if there are complaints against companies. So it's very innovative in its approach of monitoring in the industry. Nothing has been done. This is the first time that something so sophisticated and so developed is being contemplated to ensure compliance with the law within this industry. It's not perfect. It's not completely worked out. Many of the details of all these different procedures haven't been worked out at all yet. Like I said, it's undergoing major changes. But it's an interesting scheme by nature because of its participatory element, because its main objective is to institutionalize compliance. And also another aspect that's actually interesting is that states are kind of sidelined from the whole process. I mean, there are state representatives sitting in all the main organs and taking part in all these different initiatives, but the state is no longer the main player here. The main player, it's like the other players. There's no central role played by the states. It's just kind of playing the same part as civil society or the industry, and that's an interesting aspect that we might want to reflect on. Interestingly, these frameworks have been internalized at a very impressive speed by the industry, which has embraced them, like I said, welcomed them, embraced them, promoted them. If you look, for example, at the website of Triple Canopy, which is one of these companies, what you notice is that, hold on. Here we go. So if you go on the website of Triple Canopy, you can, I don't know, you cannot see it really, but let me just read you here. So first of all, on the website of Triple Canopy, there's a whole page devoted to the International Code of Conduct about how it's meant to ensure transparency and oversight and accountability. And Triple Canopy is praising the effort, right? And says how much it has participated in the effort to establish an international code of conduct since the development of the Montreux document in 2006, and even provided the company's code of conduct as a source document to the Swiss government. So really, you know, kind of self-promoting on the fact that they've participated in these multi-stakeholder initiatives. And then there's a quote from the CEO of Triple Canopy, who spoke at the signing ceremony for the International Code of Conduct and said that Triple Canopy operates at a higher standard and that the industry needed a way to ensure that all security companies were committed to the same principles. And I think perhaps most remarkably here, we see that Triple Canopy writes that our next step are to ensure that the code gains worldwide acceptance and becomes an integral part of how the industry operates and how governments and clients select security providers. We must also work to ensure that transparency, oversight, and accountability accompany the code to the full extent of its intent it's shown. So promotion of the self-regulatory scheme, a lot of involvement in it, and a commitment to its success, right? So the private actors are involved in self-regulation, they promote it, and they play a major role in the internalization of industry standard. If you remember Harold Coe and the transnational legal process and how norms are being internalized. And we're not talking about binding law here, but there's definitely a process of internalization, which is very similar to what Harold Coe described. So the main question that arises from this framework is, okay, that sounds great, we have standards, there's an effort, there's goodwill, the companies are excited, but does it work? Is self-regulation in industry actually works? Has it made a difference? And here there are some skeptics who say that this is window dressing, this is self-serving, this is a way for the companies to get more business. If you look more legitimate, you'll get more contracts, so why not do it? You have everything to gain from it. Also, by doing self-regulation, that's another argument, you avoid governmental regulation, which potentially would be stricter and more stringent. So I wanted to take these arguments very seriously and actually check what has been the impact of self-regulation on the industry. Now, measuring the impact of self-regulation is not exactly a piece of cake. It's very difficult because self-regulation is difficult to track. It is not hierarchical. It is unstructured, disorderly, and to measure it using traditional criteria, it wouldn't work. Even empirically, a very difficult thing to do. So I found that 3 benchmarks are particularly helpful when we're trying to assess. What I'm trying to do essentially is assess the normative outcome that has been produced by these schemes and see whether it is something that's satisfactory or not satisfactory. And so here are my 3 benchmarks. And I can elaborate more on why those 3 benchmarks if you want during later on. But the 3 benchmarks are transparency, participation, and accountability. So transparency, when I began working on this issue, like Bill said, I've been working on this for a long time. When I began working on this, there was nothing out there. I would sit at my desk for hours looking for information, data, who are the companies, what are they doing, what are their contracts, where are they operating, and I couldn't find anything. It was very frustrating. Today, there's so much information that it's almost overwhelming, so we've really gone a long way in making this industry more transparent. There's also much more public debate about the issue. The companies are much more open about their policies. Sometimes they even give sample contracts, so to make sure that we know what's provided in them. A lot of information on the websites, and the transparency aspect is also particularly visible. Actually, transparency is visible. That's interesting. Transparency is visible in the emerging self-regulatory frameworks themselves. Why do I say that? Because if you go, for example, to the website of the main industry association, they will walk you through the last revision of their code of conduct. Like I said, they have codes of conduct, the industry association. So they've made it so transparent. They tell you exactly who they talked to and what meetings did they have and how did they revise it and why did they revise it. And it's all extremely detailed. And it's like the 13th version of the code, and none of the other revisions were so well explained to the public, but this particular version is extremely well detailed. If you look at the ICOC, the Code of Conduct, and its steering committee, you can go on their website and all the minutes of all the meetings of the steering committee, which is putting together this mechanism, this oversight mechanism, all of them are on the website. So every time they have a conference call, you get a transcript. Every time, so it's extremely transparent. And so you see this at the industry level, you see it at the multi-stakeholder level, and you also see it at the UN. The UN itself has become so much more open and suddenly came out and said, we've been using private security military contractors the whole time, and here we've come up with a policy designed to guide our hiring of security companies. This is a revolution. This is a level of transparency that we never thought was going to ever be applied to this industry. In terms of participation, we see, as I said, a lot of participation of industry associations and companies into developing the regulation. We see much more membership in the industry association. The main industry association had 8 members in 2005, 50 members today. More than 500 companies, like I said, have signed on to the Code of Conduct. I just went to Italy for a conference on private security and military companies, and companies send representatives to these legal conferences. They come, they talk, they explain. There's really all the schemes of the IGOM and the ICOC are built on participation. So even the fact that the IGOM was all open to consultation, to public consultation, this is all participatory in nature. So huge progress in transparency, huge progress in participation. Now we get to accountability. And here the picture is a little bit more nuanced. The first challenge is that it's not even clear what accountability means when we're talking about global governance. Usually when we talk about global governance, we talk about soft accountability. So we talk about naming and shaming, we talk about peer pressure, market pressure. And there's an effort in the industry to kind of improve that. But in my mind, it's not enough. I think we should have harder accountability mechanisms in the industry, and that implies sanctions. At the moment, the main sanction that is being contemplated in all of these schemes is either suspension or expulsion. So within the companies, it's just firing the employee, except in rare circumstances, like I said, referral to public authorities. But if you look at the multi-stakeholder initiatives, the sanctions are not exactly hard enough. Although I have to say that I spoke to the representatives of the companies, and I told them, if you're being excluded from IGOM for 2 years, does it mean anything for you? Because to me, it seems like it's a joke. You excluded, and then 2 years later, you can reapply. So what's the big deal? And so they told me, first of all, very bad image to be excluded from IGOM. So nobody wants to be excluded from IGOM. And moreover, if you're a middle-sized, small-sized company, you get out of IGOM for 2 years, this might be the end of the company. You won't get contracts. So they seem, from the perspective of the companies, the sanctions seem to be actually sufficient incentive. But still, I think we should aim for more, and we should have harder sanctions. And let me show you what I mean by that. So the bottom line is transparency and participation, huge progress. Accountability, there's an effort, but we're not there yet. And how can we maximize self-regulation while overcoming those problems, those difficulties? So I looked at many global governance schemes, and I found one that I thought was particularly interesting for the industry, and that's the OECD. The OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, developed a number of standards that are applicable to multinational corporations which are involved in the member states of the OECD. So these guidelines, they impose certain obligations on corporations, from human rights to employment standards, corruption, environment, a number of things. But the OECD had to make sure that within the member states' jurisdiction, those guidelines would be implemented. How did it do that? It came up with a system, with a global governance scheme, where they have bodies at the national level, which are making sure that the multinational corporations on the jurisdiction of the state are complying with the standard. And then they have a supervisory body at the international level that kind of oversees what the local, what the states are doing. And so I wanted to think about that, and I've developed a regulatory model for the industry, which actually borrows quite a bit from the OECD, but also obviously takes into account all the innovative features of IGOM and try to kind of mix those two to enhance mostly monitoring and also harder sanctions. So you'll ask me, so why is that better than what we have now? So why is that better? For two main reasons. First of all, the schemes that we have today, they're really focused on corporate accountability, on corporations. None of them contemplates individual accountability. And we need to find incentives also for the individual contractor finding itself in Afghanistan to be interested in complying with these standards. Otherwise, you know, the company might have the greatest willingness and goodwill and faith in the standards in the world, but if the individual contractor is not doing it, then what have we gained? So I think it's this double layer of accountability, both individual and corporate, is extremely important, and I've tried to think of a way we can do that. In addition, like I said, I not only improve monitoring, but also improve sanctioning. So in a way, this model broadens the reach of self-regulation in the industry, and I'm going to briefly show you what I mean. So like I said, in the OECD, there's two levels, domestic and international, and I want to do the same thing for the industry. So I'd like to have specific bodies within the jurisdiction of the states that are part of these schemes, that are whose responsibility it is to make sure that the private companies comply with the standards. And so that means ensuring that companies apply their codes of conduct, make sure they do impose disciplinary measures on non-compliant employees, make sure that members of industry associations comply with industry associations codes, and basically performing ongoing monitoring of the performance of and compliance with the industry standards. The domestic bodies could also serve as a forum for discussion by encouraging a dialogue between the various industry players within a given state. And most importantly, and I really want to emphasize this aspect, if at the national level there's a situation that looks like there's been a violation of a code or a violation of the industry standards, they must have the ability to refer that to an international body who in turn will be taking harder measures. And I'm getting to that in a second. So the sanctioning would be mostly taking place at the international level. So it basically splits monitoring from sanctioning, but to make it more efficient, because the domestic bodies are more capable of doing monitoring because they're right there. And the international body is much more capable of supervising and of taking care of the more difficult cases and imposing the sanctions. And imposing sanctions against companies. So fines, for example, reparations to the victims that have been suffering from a violation, even making a public or private apology. That's something that companies probably won't enjoy very much. Contractors also can, we should have sanctions against contractors. Again, this is something that doesn't exist. We should have the ability to refer the individual contractor to a national or international judicial authority for prosecution. And that, I think, having more sanctions, a greater range of sanctions, not just expulsion, not just suspension from the schemes, but actual sanctions this might raise objections within the industry. I'm not sure it will be welcome right away, but I do think that we've reached a point in the regulation of the industry where we do have the momentum for that. In other words, we've gone so far, so quickly, that this is the time to kind of try to promote that. What does that mean for global governance? And I know I have to wrap up, but we need to ask ourselves, this law that is being, these norms and standards of conduct, they are changing the fabric of human rights law, of humanitarian law. And what does that mean? It is non-state actors with public actors writing up these norms. Where do they fit within the theory of sources that we know in international law? Can non-state actors create customary international law, for example? And here, I think what I would be most interested in is if in your own experience, you're aware of other non-state actors that may have also an impact on international law. So I know there are two great scholars who have analyzed the lawmaking by armed groups. Lawmaking by armed groups, in other words, here we're talking about just a private actor, not even with public actors, writing up standards and codes of conduct and all that. And armed groups is a nice way to talk about terrorist groups also. So it's not just private security and military contractors, it's a broader phenomenon, and there must be other non-state actors out there who either do that or could potentially be brought to do that in order to, if we're trying to regulate their conduct. There are more and more non-state actors in the international arena. I don't need to get into that. And this wouldn't work for all of them. It's a case-by-case basis assessment. Not all non-state actors can get involved in lawmaking. But what we see through the experience of the private security and military industry is that when they do get involved in this kind of lawmaking processes, the internalization of the standards, the legitimacy of the standards is so much greater. So in terms of compliance and reception of the standards, we've achieved so much more. If we compare that, for example, to, let's say, an international treaty, okay? So states decide that they want to regulate the industry. They sit around the international conference. It takes years. Okay, eventually they get to something. Then they come to the industry and they say, okay, guys, this is the treaty. Now, you have to work with it. This applies to you. The industry would never apply it. It would say, okay, we haven't been involved. We don't know what this is about. Even if we've been involved, we don't like the final product. We've avoided all of these issues by getting them to participate, by having an inclusive regulatory process. And we need to think about that as we contemplate other areas or other non-state actors that we've been trying to regulate, because this has been, in my mind, a very successful experience. Again, not done, not finished, still a lot of work to do, but nevertheless, it raises some possibilities for involving other non-state actors in a regulation. So this is just a summary of what I just said. And with that, I really look forward to your comments and suggestions. And again, if you can think of other non-state actors that have been involved in similar activities, that would be particularly interesting to me. Thank you.
Time for some questions. My nephew just went, I guess he's in Afghanistan for a second time. Last time he went for, I've heard through the great family grapevine, he's an intelligence specialist who went to SU. He was about the sixth in the family to go to SU. And first time he went for about 7 or 8 months into Afghanistan, and I'm told he came back with about $300,000, which I guess is not taxable. The second time he was told he was going to be fired if he didn't go back, or he was given the hint that he was going to be fired if he didn't go back, because his roommate in his condo had gotten fired like within a month or two before. And my nephew's response to the family grapevine, I guess, was that, yeah, he was going to go back, but it wasn't for the money, which is maybe honest because he didn't need any money. Right then, he's got enough money for the next 10 years or whatever. But rather because he's a software specialist and had come up with a new scheme of monitoring that he thought might save 18-year-olds' lives. Which you might say, well, he's got a high goal. He's not selfish. The problem I have with this is this may take a jump. We have U.S. senators who have never spent, any one of them that I know, 1 month in any of these war zones. So it's very nice to have a bureaucracy that says, let's invent this scheme where we're cleaner to everybody's eyes. And the wars continue against the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. And to put this even more practically, in practical rather than moral terms, I come from a life insurance family where my brother is the general agent of the largest life insurance provider in Syracuse with like 100 people. That's my family, second generation. What I'm getting at here is based on human life value. This all would have some meaning for me if it followed my own goal or suggestion that when people die in war, someone pays, and they pay big bucks. And I'm not talking about 10,000. I'm talking about maybe minimum of 150,000 for every person who dies. Now, when that happens, we'll maybe get some response back to the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. But until something like that happens, this is all very nice, but people are making big bucks for looking nice and continuing war.
Okay, Bill, do you want to take a few questions, or do you want to take one or the other? Whatever you
Well, if you want to react to that,
Yeah, that's fine.
let's move on.
So, look, I understand what you're saying, and like I said, this industry needs to be regulated, and there needs to be some kind of accountability. In other words, if something happens, there needs to be a way to hold people accountable, and that's exactly my objective. Now, if we compare that to the military forces, okay, because obviously I sent in your comment that this is because these are individuals who are making a lot of money and they are not part of the armed forces. That's really what's disturbing, and I understand that.
Well, it's what's driving the size of this, too.
Right. But look at the military armed forces, okay? When it's not like soldiers always abide by humanitarian law and by human rights law. They don't always do it. The main difference so we're not trying to eliminate all likelihood of abuses. That's not going to happen. Even in the armed forces, we have abuses. Now, the difference is that within the armed forces, and again, even that is arguable, but you do have a set framework through which the soldier will have to go in order to be held accountable. You know, disciplinary actions within the military and potentially have to account for his acts, and he will be punished. So we know what will happen to him. The problem with the contractors is that when something like this happens, there is no framework through which to hold them accountable. So again, I think we need to keep in mind that none of these, we're not going to eliminate all excesses and all problems, but we want to have a structure, we have a framework, and this privatization is not also going to go away. So we just have to deal with what we have. What we have is that a need for these services, and now we need to find a way to make sure that is a structure and there's a framework for it, and that's what we're working on. Evan?
I wanted to pick up on the last part of your presentation. I thought it was a fascinating presentation. It seems to me that one narrative you could sort of spin out here is that private contractors have had strong incentives in the last 4 years to increase transparency, their participation and so forth, because international organizations and states have been demanding it. So there's been sort of a market explanation for why this is all happening. I wonder whether you think the next step to accountability, whether there still are going to be the same incentives that private corporations may have to increase accountability mechanisms. How we might, it seems that if states and international organizations require this by contract or otherwise, then it could very well happen. There would be incentives for these corporations to come forward and to offer voluntarily this sort of accountability mechanism.
But this is what they're doing. That's
So how do you see this playing out over the
So
next
I think
5 to 10
it's
years?
going. I think it's not the end of it. I think, look, the IGOM, the oversight mechanism, which is being worked out, is being pushed by these companies because those are the signatory companies to the International Code of Conduct. By signing on to the Code of Conduct, they already agreed to be committed to this and make it move forward to having a real system for monitoring compliance and sanctioning. So the companies are all in favor of that. So the market drive, if you want, is there. And this is what I'm saying when I say we have momentum. It's gone really fast. And I've spoken to the people who are turning around the second draft of the IGOM, and they're late by a few months, and they're in a rush. They want to turn it around. They want to implement the comments. They said there were many problems with the first draft, and they got lots of good feedback. But they're going to have not a single doubt that within a few months we're getting the second draft, and it will be implemented. And then potentially that's the last stop. But again, I think there are some adjustments that you need to make to the IGOM, in particularly in the type of sanctions and all that. But this is, I've looked at the self-regulatory initiatives in other industries and sectors. I don't think there's been a sector that has put this kind of regulatory framework together in such a short time and in such a sophisticated manner with so much drive and so much enthusiasm, kind of really putting it together, making it roll from one step to another. And that's part of my point here, is that beyond the industry, we can learn here for how to regulate how to go about global governance and self-regulation in much more general terms. So then I often hear the comment that, okay, but you're talking about war and security. Do you really think that war and security could be a good case study for self-regulation of, I don't know, other sectors that are much less problematic? And in a way, it's true. But I think when we look at the private security and military industry and how much it has made war as a business, it has eliminated kind of this uniqueness. Not entirely, but we've kind of overcome this step where security and war is an entirely different area, which we cannot learn anything from for other areas. So I think we need to keep that in the back of our minds. Yes, it's true that it's a very specific area where we are the potential of depriving, of hurting human rights and depriving of liberty and killing people is major. But at the same time, if we look at it from the perspective of governance and regulation, yes, it's working. The market is driving it, and they're putting together these schemes, and it's going real fast. And I would argue that it's going well. So, that's not the end of the story, but we have a path.
Thanks so much for giving me a lot of information. My class that I have to lecture at next week. Some of my students are here. So, but
What's your class about?
International security.
Oh, okay, great.
But I wanted to ask how you can realize effective monitoring at the domestic level in places where there's rampant corruption, where we're talking about failed states, where they can barely monitor their own governance structures and their own security forces. How do we anticipate, how do you anticipate that these governments or civil society, there's no civil society in some of these places, so how's that practically going to work without international organizations in there? And these are often places where society wants the IOs out, right? So do we turn to NGOs? Do we turn to groups that have more legitimacy to do that? When the nation lacks legitimacy, right? How's the monitoring going to happen vis-a-vis society and these industries?
I think it's a great question. Great question. At the domestic level, so the way let's just talk now for a second about what I envisage for in general, and then we can talk about failed states. So in general, and I didn't get into this detail, but what I envisage is that locally or domestically, this domestic monitoring office, the role of this domestic monitoring office will be played by either an industry association, if there's one there. So that's the case, for example, in the UK. That was the case in Iraq. So sometimes you do have industry associations locally, but it's not the norm. But when there is an industry association, that industry association could play the monitoring role. Okay, so that's the general idea. Now, in failed states, and I think that's a really a good question, we have a problem because, like you said, we're not going to be able to monitor this as well. So we will have a structure that will be specifically created in that state, and that structure will face significant obstacle. And that's why we have the supervisory body, the international supervisory body, whose role it will be to help the domestic office, to send people there, and to help them try to, to the extent possible, it probably won't be ideal situation over there, but at least have some local monitoring and very strong reinforcement coming from the international body. Now, again, going into the further details of who's going to play this international body, and just, because I think it really helps with your question, one of my suggestions is that there's a UN working group on mercenaries within the United Nations. And this UN working group, I think, could play the role of being the supervisory body. And if so, that would actually really help with the problem of failed states, because the UN working group is used to visiting these kind of environments, to speaking to the people that matter. They know who matters and where. I mean, the UN has many flaws, but actually in this aspect, I think it would be very helpful. So the UN working group would actually know, as the supervisory body, how to strengthen the local antennas and how to make sure that the monitoring is taking place to some extent locally, and also provide the help and the support that is needed at the international level. So that's the way I envisage it in areas that are much more volatile and problematic from a civil society and point of view.
Have time for one more?
I have a question about prosecuting PNCs. Because obviously they can be prosecuted under Geneva Convention or for war crimes. Mm-hmm. So in this case, the mechanism would be, would just fall under the obligation to report a crime, which the supervisor of the PNC would face. And then that person would be transferred to the normal, regular judicial system, right?
Right, exactly. So what it would be is that it would be identified kind of locally with the domestic monitoring office. Then the domestic monitoring office would say, okay, we might want to look further into this. Maybe the international body can also look into this. And then it would be the responsibility of the international body to decide. It's not such a complicated scheme, by the way. Then the international body would just decide, okay, do we refer this person either back to the local authorities, which wouldn't work in failed states, or in an international court. It may not happen every time, but I think it should be an option, of having this kind of prosecution. And even when even if the person was operating, if the contractor was deployed in a failed state area where there's no way to hold him accountable there, it could be that a state of nationality. There are different jurisdictions that could assert competence over this person. So just have the option, because right now it's not even contemplated. So just to have the option of referring in the extreme cases and whenever it's possible for prosecution.
Daphné, that was a great talk. Many thanks.
Thank you.